Hello, so my name is Gilles Dufrasne. I'm with an NGO called Carbon Market Watch. I'm from Belgium and I'm based in Belgium. I work from there. And what we're doing here is following carbon market negotiations. So there are big international markets being established under the climate agreements, which essentially allow countries to trade emission reductions, trade carbon. So what does it do? What's the objective to trade carbon? The idea is essentially to allow rich countries which have climate targets to buy emission reductions from developing countries. Because in many cases, this allows them to get cheaper emission reductions and so potentially have more ambitious climate targets by getting more projects and more emission reductions for certain budgets. So the idea is really to increase climate action through carbon markets. But that's, of course, the theory. And the big question is, how does this perform in practice? And so I'm here with my colleague, Erika, who also follows this with me and knows a lot about what are the real-world implications of markets.
Yes, thanks, Gilles. And my name's Erika, Lennon, and I'm with the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, which is an NGO based in Washington, D.C. And I think the theory behind carbon markets is exactly as you explained it. But in practice, what we've seen in the past is that that's not always true. And that really what it's allowing for is for rich countries to keep polluting without actually reducing emissions, which they need to do, and to just sort of buy offsets, but then it's not actually reducing emissions or doing anything to help the temperature goals, but it's just inflating, it's just allowing them to continue business as usual while also potentially harming communities. Because what we've seen in the carbon markets that have happened under the Kyoto Protocol is that oftentimes these projects don't take into account the impacts on the local communities and respecting their rights, and so it's violating their rights. And so importantly, those things need to be corrected while we're here. But, I think that one of the things that also violates rights is not keeping temperature rise below 1.5, and so will carbon markets help with that?
Yeah, I think you make the very good point of using offsets, and that's really the whole logic of carbon markets at the moment. It's based on this idea that you emit somewhere and then you reduce your emissions somewhere else, and in the end, what the atmosphere sees is no difference, right? Because you are just having +1 somewhere, -1 somewhere, and you just have zero difference. What we need at the moment is, we know that collective action and ambition is really not at the level that's required, and we need to really reduce emissions. And this is also what we need in the carbon market. So we need a system that's really going to bring not only new projects and new emission reductions, but emission reductions that are not used to justify pollution somewhere else. And the big risk and the big political discussions at the moment happening here are around all these accounting rules, the setup of these mechanisms, making sure that we're not double counting the emission reductions. This seems like a very insane idea. I mean, if we want to reach our targets, we have to make sure we count the emission reductions properly and are using them to demonstrate achievement of those targets. And we also want to make sure we get new projects and not just relying on emission reductions that have been achieved in the past already, because we already have carbon markets today, and they have generated credits and emission reductions, and we don't really want to rely on past reductions to meet new targets. So it's very important that these systems generate this new effort, and at the same time, as you're saying, prevent that there are negative impacts on people. And maybe, I know you've worked a lot on this, so maybe you have an example of how projects specifically can harm people.
Yeah, I think that what we've seen is that with the past projects, not only have they not necessarily contributed to emissions reductions, but they've had negative impacts. And so we're also here with some of our community partners from a town in the Cajon del Maipo in Chile, where a hydroelectric project that is verified under the Clean Development Mechanism, which was the Kyoto carbon market, has really impacted their right to food and water and impacted their housing and will impact the tourism industry. And so I think that one of the things that's important is that the UN isn't sanctioning carbon markets that are also then harming communities. And I think that's one of the keys for why we need the international regime to sort of address this. And then I guess the last question is sort of, what about domestic carbon markets? So I know in the US there are a few that exist, but there's, the US's status with the Paris Agreement is a bit iffy right now. But so will those be impacted, or what are, can you say?
Yeah, what we see is that it's really working on a similar logic that at the moment in the US and in other places in the world, companies can compensate their emissions, so buying carbon credits to claim that they don't have an impact on the climate even though they continue to emit. And what we're setting up here is essentially a similar system for countries where countries would be buying these carbon credits to compensate their emissions. And so we really need to make sure that what we are setting up is a system that works to reduce emissions, that has proper accounting, that drives new projects, and that doesn't impact people and the environment in a negative way.